The ultimatum was set. The rhetoric was uncompromising. Washington declared its completely rebuilt military machinery was primed to strike Iranian power plants and bridges immediately. But then, the world witnessed something unexpected. A sudden extension of the ceasefire, wrapped in confusing claims about Pakistani intervention and complaints about fake news. What really stopped the most powerful military in the world from pulling the trigger? Is it a strategic pause? Or is the administration desperately searching for a face-saving exit strategy before the global economic chessboard completely turns against them? Welcome to the real geopolitical game behind the headlines. Let us dive in. Indeed, the initial ultimatum was absolute, delivered with the kind of theatrical certainty that markets and military planners usually interpret as a point of no return. Washington had explicitly signaled that the machinery of the most expensive military in human history was locked, loaded, and fully authorized to obliterate Iranian power plants and critical infrastructure. Yet, as the sun rose over the Middle East, the anticipated shock and awe never materialized. Instead, the world received a sudden, open-ended extension of the ceasefire, heavily conditioned upon the continuation of a suffocating naval blockade. The official narrative out of Washington hastily attributed this strategic pause to a direct, last-minute intervention by the military and political leadership in Pakistan, framing it as a concession to regional allies. Tehran, however, immediately shattered this narrative, flatly denying that any such request for a ceasefire was ever made on their behalf. Moving beyond mere denial, Iran drew a definitive red line, insisting that the complete removal of the maritime blockade and the immediate release of seized vessels are the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisites for any future diplomatic dialogue. Tehran has boldly declared itself fully prepared for the resumption of outright hostilities, viewing the blockade itself as an intolerable act of war. To truly understand why the trigger was not pulled, one must look past the diplomatic theatrics and examine the cold, unforgiving mathematics of maritime warfare in the 21st century. The Persian Gulf is not merely a body of water. It is the most critical cardiovascular artery of the global energy supply chain. Approximately 20% of the world's daily petroleum consumption transits through the narrow, highly contested Strait of Hormuz. When a superpower attempts to seal off such a strategic choke point, it operates a geopolitical tourniquet that inevitably begins to starve the global economy, including its own allies. Maintaining a comprehensive naval blockade requires the indefinite deployment of massive carrier strike groups. The operational expenditure of a single strike group exceeds $7 million every single day, not accounting for the accelerated wear on advanced aircraft and the immense logistical strain on the supply lines. Furthermore, historical precedents of naval quarantines in this specific region reveal a terrifying reality. Blockades rarely force immediate capitulation from entrenched regional powers without triggering catastrophic asymmetrical retaliation. Tehran has spent decades perfecting the art of maritime disruption, developing capabilities that directly threaten the vulnerability of large, conventional naval vessels. The administration in Washington knows that a kinetic exchange here would instantly send global shipping insurance premiums into the stratosphere, triggering a supply chain heart attack that would paralyze industrialized economies from Europe to East Asia. The hesitation, therefore, reveals a stark truth about modern warfare. When an empire realizes that pulling the trigger will inevitably inflict fatal economic collateral damage upon itself. A postponed war is simply a fragile mask for a strategic impasse. Behind the veil of these delayed strikes and extended deadlines lies a profound political paralysis. The current administration in Washington is not genuinely attempting to choreograph a new devastating war. Rather, it is desperately trying to reverse engineer a dignified retreat. The ultimate geopolitical objective right now is to discover a mechanism for a graceful face-saving withdrawal from an increasingly untenable standoff. To secure this exit, the administration requires a tangible, highly publicized concession from Tehran, primarily centered around the dismantling of its nuclear capabilities and the physical transport of enriched nuclear materials entirely outside of Iranian borders. If Washington could secure this single trophy, the leadership could declare a definitive victory to its domestic audience and immediately begin scaling down its regional military footprint. However, Tehran is categorically refusing to play its assigned role in this political theater. The Iranian leadership has made it abundantly clear that surrendering their nuclear material is an absolute non-starter. They will not even entertain the conversation. This refusal places the American administration in an excruciating historical predicament, denying them what foreign policy strategists coldly refer to as a decent interval. Historically, when a major global power recognizes that a specific geopolitical theater has become a strategic sinkhole, it actively seeks a cosmetic diplomatic agreement. This agreement is inherently designed to create a temporary illusion of regional stability, allowing the retreating power to withdraw its forces honorably before the localized power structures inevitably unravel. The world witnessed this exact architectural retreat during the withdrawal from Southeast Asia in the 1970s, and more recently during the chaotic exit from Central Asia. Yet, by holding a rigid, uncompromising line, Iran is flatly denying Washington the luxury of this cosmetic victory, effectively trapping the administration in its own web of maximalist demands. To understand why a rapid, albeit dignified, withdrawal is secretly desired by Washington, one must simply examine the unforgiving domestic data. The United States is currently balancing a staggering sovereign debt burden that has eclipsed $34 trillion, with annual interest payments now threatening to surpass its own monumental defense budget. Furthermore, the domestic demographic reality is one of profound operational exhaustion. Decades of continuous foreign deployments have entirely hollowed out the political appetite for overseas entanglements. Extensive public surveys consistently indicate that roughly 70% of the American working class electorate vehemently opposes initiating any new large-scale kinetic operations in the Middle East. Attempting to execute a sustained multi-trillion-dollar military campaign against a highly fortified mountainous nation of nearly 90 million people, a nation equipped with a deeply entrenched, battle-tested military infrastructure, is financially suicidal and politically radioactive. Washington currently resembles a seasoned tightrope walker who has confidently marched halfway across a treacherous canyon, only to realize the safety net has been quietly removed, and a fierce storm is rapidly approaching. They cannot gracefully walk backward to the platform without admitting a profound strategic miscalculation. Yet taking another blind step forward guarantees a catastrophic fall. When an adversary fundamentally refuses to construct a golden bridge for your retreat, you are left stranded, imprisoned by the very grandstanding rhetoric you utilized to initiate the conflict. And the pressure mounting on Washington is not merely political. It is intensely chronological. We are witnessing a catastrophic collision of rigid geopolitical deadlines that leave the American administration with absolutely zero maneuvering room in approximately 20 days. By mid-May, the United States president is scheduled for a highly anticipated, high-stakes diplomatic visit to China. Consider the absolute strategic necessity of entering such a monumental negotiation from a position of undisputed strength. If Washington fails to engineer a dignified, face-saving exit from the Iranian quagmire before this crucial summit, what diplomatic leverage does it actually possess? Walking into a complex bilateral negotiation with Beijing, while completely bogged down in a fresh, open-ended conflict in the Middle East, is the diplomatic equivalent of playing high-stakes poker with your cards facing outward. A superpower entangled in an unwinnable regional proxy war fundamentally lacks the strategic bandwidth and the global credibility to project authority on the grand stage of the Asia-Pacific. If this critical diplomatic trip is postponed yet again to manage the fallout of the Iranian crisis, the resulting optics of imperial disarray would be an unmitigated geopolitical disaster. It would signal to the entire globe that American foreign policy is entirely reactive, paralyzed by its own militaristic overreach. But the geopolitical clock ticks even louder as we approach mid-July. The United States administration is aggressively slated to announce the final results of its Section 301 investigations. A sweeping, unilateral trade mechanism designed to impose punitive tariffs on virtually all major developed economies, aggressively targeting traditional allies across the European Union, Japan, and beyond. Let us analyze the sheer macroeconomic insanity of executing this dual-front approach. The European Union alone represents a massive, highly integrated trading bloc with a gross domestic product exceeding $17 trillion. By weaponizing Section 301 tariffs against allied automotive, precision aerospace, and high-tech manufacturing sectors, Washington actively risks severing the very economic arteries that sustain the transatlantic alliance. Imposing a sweeping 10 to 20% tariff wall on European and allied goods will instantly trigger immediate, symmetrical trade retaliation, destabilizing hundreds of billions of dollars in cross-border commerce. Now, deeply imagine the catastrophic structural vulnerability of the global supply chain if these two distinct crises simultaneously merge, launching a kinetic war against Iran, which would instantly choke off 20% of global oil transit and send global inflation spiraling, while simultaneously initiating a devastating unilateral trade war against your own closest economic allies, is not a grand strategy. It is a blueprint for geopolitical suicide. The United States would find itself fighting a complex military battle in the Persian Gulf and a brutal, multi-front trade war across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans simultaneously. A nation operating this way is like a desperate arsonist setting fire to the very structural pillars of the bridge they are currently standing on, blindly hoping the raging flames will somehow intimidate the silent observers gathered on the opposite shore. The inevitable result of such isolated, erratic aggression is not global dominance, but a profound, completely self-inflicted structural quarantine. When an empire fundamentally mistakes the systematic alienation of the entire international community for a bold assertion of sovereign strength. The countdown to its own irreversible isolation has already commenced. Perhaps sensing this impending isolation, the recent late-night manifesto published by the United States President serves as a remarkable psychological artifact that requires deep analytical dissection. In a sprawling defense, exceeding 100 words, he explicitly denied that any external nation or hidden influence convinced him to mobilize for war. Instead, he attributed his military posturing solely to the geopolitical aftermath of October the 7th and his lifelong, unyielding conviction that Iran must never acquire nuclear weapons. Furthermore, he aggressively dismissed 90% of mainstream news and independent polling data as entirely fabricated, drawing defensive parallels to contested domestic elections and the political turbulence in Venezuela. He even suggested that if the new Iranian leadership were simply smart enough, they could still enjoy a prosperous future. Why would the leader of the most powerful nation on earth issue such a hyper-defensive public declaration? The underlying motivations reveal a profound structural vulnerability. First, he fundamentally cannot admit to being manipulated or dragged into a conflict by regional actors. Acknowledging such strategic gullibility would immediately invite devastating domestic political attacks, potentially providing his political rivals with the exact ammunition needed to initiate impeachment proceedings based on gross executive incompetence. Second, and far more alarming, is the palpable, unspoken fear of the entrenched, invisible power structures operating within the United States. Over the past 3 years, more than a dozen top-tier domestic experts and strategic dissenters have been inexplicably marginalized or entirely removed from the geopolitical chessboard. The president, despite nominally holding the highest executive office, is acutely aware of the permanent intelligence apparatus and the sprawling military-industrial complex, formidable entities that frequently operate entirely independent of democratic oversight. It is an open secret in Washington that even towering technology billionaires, famous for their boundless public arrogance, display a striking, almost docile compliance when forced to navigate these shadowy corridors of institutional power. Finally, one cannot ignore the undeniable element of extreme executive narcissism. A leader utterly convinced of his own unparalleled brilliance simply cannot mentally process the terrifying possibility that he has been completely outmaneuvered. This paralyzing friction between the visible executive branch and the invisible permanent state is a uniquely American strategic liability. When observing other major geopolitical actors on the grand chessboard, such as China or Russia, one witnesses a significantly higher degree of vertical integration in long-term strategic execution. Their foreign policy is rarely held hostage by warring bureaucratic factions or domestic intelligence agencies running unauthorized parallel agendas. In Washington, however, the commander-in-chief is frequently forced to negotiate not just with foreign adversaries, but with his own deeply entrenched defense establishment. The tragic irony of the president's public denial is that it starkly highlights his total. His personal interpretation of this geopolitical crisis is completely detached from the consensus of almost every other rational actor on the global stage. European allies, Chinese strategists, Russian diplomats, and even a significant portion of the domestic American populace all share a unified, unspoken conclusion. The administration has been comprehensively deceived in the brutal, unforgiving arena of international relations. How a leader perceives their own actions is entirely irrelevant. The only metric that truly dictates reality is how the rest of the world perceives that leader. Because that collective perception ultimately dictates their coordinated diplomatic and economic retaliation. A leader trapped inside a self-constructed echo chamber, loudly declaring his own absolute sovereignty, while being quietly steered by hidden institutional currents, is much like a ship's captain fiercely gripping a disconnected steering wheel, while the relentless tide pulls the heavy vessel toward the jagged rocks. Meanwhile, across the strategic chessboard, the internal dynamics within Tehran present another layer of profound complexity that Washington frequently miscalculates. According to deep-level regional intelligence, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the true architectural force behind the nation's resistance economy and forward military posture, has exerted overwhelming pressure on their own diplomatic negotiators, mandating consequently, no Iranian delegation has even boarded an aircraft to Pakistan to initiate backdoor diplomatic communications. Tehran has anchored its geopolitical position to two absolute, non-negotiable demands: the immediate release of all seized commercial vessels and the total, verifiable lifting of the American maritime blockade. Until these specific conditions are met, they remain fully mobilized and mentally prepared to absorb the initial shock of an open kinetic conflict. While this unyielding resistance has undeniably frustrated Washington's tactical objectives over the past month, a deeper, insidious long-term strategic danger now looms directly over Tehran. Prominent geopolitical strategists have correctly identified a critical, potentially fatal juncture for Iranian foreign policy. The ultimate path to enduring security and economic vitality for Iran does not lie in perpetual, isolated military resistance, but rather in comprehensive economic reconciliation with its immediate Arab neighbors across the Persian Gulf. Specifically, regional economic heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. The recent historic diplomatic normalization between Tehran and Riyadh, brilliantly brokered by Beijing, established a fragile but essential foundation for a multipolar, stabilized Middle East. However, if Tehran misinterprets its current tactical success against the United States as a divine mandate for unilateral regional dominance, it risks squandering this monumental diplomatic momentum entirely. There is a deeply intoxicating, dangerous temptation for any nation that successfully repels an empire to immediately project that newly validated power onto its smaller, weaker neighbors. If Iran attempts to leverage its formidable, asymmetrical naval capabilities to aggressively regulate the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps by imposing exorbitant, arbitrary transit fees on all neighboring commercial shipping, or demanding absolute political compliance for safe maritime passage, the geopolitical blowback will be instantaneous and severe. We have witnessed this exact paradigm of regional overreach before. Consider the historical trajectory of India in South Asia. New Delhi's chronic, heavy-handed pursuit of absolute regional hegemony has frequently alienated its immediate neighbors, actively driving them to seek advanced strategic partnerships with outside global powers merely to counterbalance Indian dominance. If Tehran adopts a similarly aggressive, exclusionary posture in the Gulf. The inevitable outcome is mathematically predictable. The very Arab states they desperately need to court for long-term economic integration will be violently pushed back under the protective security umbrellas of Washington and other external military actors. A fortress that permanently raises its massive drawbridge to repel an invading empire, only to begin firing flaming arrows at the local merchants attempting to trade, will not be defeated by a grand military siege, but by its own self-inflicted economic starvation. True geopolitical maturity requires knowing precisely when to sheathe the sword. Winning a tense tactical standoff against a superpower means absolutely nothing if the resulting arrogance burns the only viable bridge to your own long-term regional prosperity. Ultimately, this tense standoff in the Gulf is not merely a localized skirmish. It is a profound symptom of a transitioning global order, while Washington scrambles to project overwhelming strength without actually committing to a disastrous entanglement. Tehran holds the line, dangerously testing the absolute limits of its own regional influence. For objective observers of the grand chessboard, the lesson remains clear. True geopolitical power lies not in the mere capacity to bomb, but in the strategic patience required to build enduring, multipolar alliances.